At 6,500 feet above Amsterdam, El Al Flight 1862 was doing what a Boeing 747 was designed to do. It was climbing normally after departing Schiphol Airport, carrying cargo and 4 people in the cockpit. Then the right inboard engine separated from the wing. The failure was violent. The engine and its pylon tore away from the aircraft and struck the adjacent engine. Engine number 4 was damaged and separated as well. In a matter of seconds, the 747 had lost 2 engines on the same side. But the immediate problem was not simply that 2 engines had stopped producing thrust. It was that the aircraft itself was no longer responding normally. The pilots did not have a clear picture of how extensive the damage was. From the cockpit, they were dealing with warnings, abnormal handling, and an aircraft that had suddenly become very different from the one they had been flying only moments earlier. Yet there was still a possibility. Schiphol was nearby. The crew could turn back. And with 2 engines still operating on the left wing, a return to the airport appeared possible. They contacted air traffic control and began preparing to come back. At first, the problem seemed like something they might still be able to manage. The airport was within reach. The aircraft was still flying. The crew still had thrust. And they had a runway waiting for them. But the plan depended on something they had not yet discovered. The aircraft had to be able to configure for landing. A 747 cannot simply point toward a runway and descend. As it slows, its wings need to generate enough lift to keep the aircraft airborne. That is why the flaps are extended during a normal approach. They change the aerodynamic characteristics of the wing and allow the aircraft to fly safely at lower speeds. For Flight 1862, that normal sequence was about to become another problem. The crew selected the first stage of flaps. The aircraft did not respond as expected. The flap system was not functioning normally. And that meant the problem was no longer confined to the engines. The engines had separated violently from the right wing, and the damage had gone into the structure and systems around them. The crew now had to deal with an aircraft that had lost much more than thrust. The return to Schiphol was still possible, but the aircraft they were trying to bring back was no longer configured like a normal 747. The crew continued preparing for the approach while trying to understand what the aircraft was telling them. Some warnings were difficult to interpret. Some systems were no longer behaving normally. And some of the information arriving in the cockpit did not clearly reveal the extent of the physical damage. The aircraft was still in the air, but every step toward a normal landing was becoming harder. The crew needed to slow down. They needed to configure the aircraft. They needed to turn toward the runway. And they needed enough control authority to keep the aircraft stable and aligned. Those requirements were beginning to work against each other. The damage to the right wing had disabled important hydraulic systems and damaged components involved in controlling the aircraft. The surviving engines were both on the left side. That created another problem. Increasing thrust could help maintain altitude and speed, but it also increased the asymmetric forces the crew had to manage. The aircraft could still fly, but it no longer had the same control margin as a healthy 747. That distinction mattered. An aircraft does not have to become completely uncontrollable before recovery becomes impossible. It only has to lose enough control authority that the remaining margin disappears. For Flight 1862, that margin was becoming smaller as the approach continued. The crew had to keep the aircraft moving towards Schiphol while dealing with the consequences of the damage. Even aligning with the runway was becoming difficult. They needed enough thrust to remain airborne. They needed enough speed to preserve what control capability remained. And they needed enough precision to position the aircraft for landing. The closer they came to the runway, the less room they had to correct an error. As the aircraft slowed, the damaged flight controls had less aerodynamic authority available to them. The problem was no longer simply getting back to the airport. It was whether the aircraft could remain controllable long enough to reach the runway in a condition that allowed the crew to land it. The crew continued maneuvering. The aircraft was descending. The runway was ahead. But the margin was disappearing. Then the aircraft began to roll. The situation deteriorated rapidly. The 747 rolled sharply to the right. The nose dropped as the aircraft entered an aerodynamic stall. Ground proximity warnings sounded in the cockpit. But there was no longer enough altitude to recover. The aircraft struck the ground near the airport. The flight was over. But the question remained. How could a Boeing 747 that had been flying normally only minutes earlier lose two engines, suffer extensive wing and system damage, and become almost impossible to control? The answer began long before the final approach. Investigators first had to determine why engine number 3 had separated from the aircraft in the first place. The engine had not simply fallen away because of an ordinary engine failure. The pylon structure connecting the engine to the wing had failed. Inside that structure, fatigue damage had developed over time. Fatigue cracking is different from a sudden overload. A structure can survive thousands of normal flight cycles, while a small crack slowly grows inside it. At first, the damage may be almost impossible to detect. But with every cycle, the loads continue. Eventually, a crack can reach a point where the remaining structure can no longer carry the required loads. That is what happened to the attachment structure of engine number 3. At approximately 6,500 feet, the structure failed. The engine and pylon separated from the right wing, and the separation created a second disaster. As engine number 3 departed the aircraft, it struck engine number 4. The second engine was also lost. But the engines were not the only things affected. The violent separation damaged the wing itself. It damaged hydraulic systems. It damaged flight control components. It damaged leading-edge structures. And it created a combination of failures that the pilots could not fully understand from inside the cockpit. The aircraft had suddenly lost 2 engines, but it had also lost important parts of the systems that allowed the remaining aircraft to be controlled. That explained why the return became so difficult. The flap problem was not an isolated malfunction. It was evidence of the physical damage caused by the engine separation. The control difficulties were not simply the result of having 2 engines out. They were part of a much larger chain. The aircraft was damaged on the right side. Important hydraulic systems were disabled. The remaining engines were both on the left. And as the aircraft slowed for the approach, the remaining control capability became increasingly critical. Even some cockpit warnings became difficult to interpret. A fire indication associated with engine number 3 appeared after the engine had already separated. The warning did not necessarily mean that the missing engine was burning. The investigation found that damage to the aircraft's sensing and wiring systems most probably caused the warning. To the crew, however, the warning was another piece of information they had to process during an emergency that was already evolving faster than they could fully diagnose it. That was one of the defining features of Flight 1862. The pilots were not dealing with one clean failure. They were dealing with a cascade. One structural failure created another. The first engine separation caused the loss of the second engine. The separation damaged the wing. The wing damage disabled important systems. Those system failures reduced the aircraft's control capability. And the reduced control capability became more dangerous as the aircraft slowed for landing. By the time the crew was approaching Schiphol, the problem was no longer simply whether the airplane could reach the airport. It was whether the aircraft could remain within the narrow limits of controllability long enough to land. The crew was confronted with a situation that standard emergency procedures could not fully solve. They had an aircraft still flying, but one that had been radically changed by a structural failure they could not see. They had thrust, but only on one side. They had control, but far less than normal. They had a runway, but an increasingly limited ability to align with it. And they had very little altitude with which to recover if the aircraft exceeded the remaining margin. The investigation eventually showed that the accident was not caused by a single final mistake. It was the result of a chain that began with structural fatigue and ended with the loss of control. The investigation also identified weaknesses in the design and certification of the 747 engine pylon attachment system, as well as shortcomings in the inspection system that allowed the fatigue damage to remain undetected. The accident led to changes intended to prevent similar failures from occurring again. But the most disturbing part of Flight 1862 was not simply that an engine separated from a Boeing 747. It was what happened afterward. The aircraft did not lose one thing. It lost one thing, which caused another thing to fail, which damaged another system, which reduced another layer of control. What began as an engine separation became a cascading loss of the systems the crew needed to bring the aircraft home. And by the time they understood how much of the aircraft had been damaged, there was no longer enough altitude, control, authority, or margin left to recover.